Welcome back, Woo Crew. We're here for another episode of the Woo Curious podcast, and I am your host, Ellie. And I'm here with my co-host today,
Eileen.
and we're going to talk to you today about some more sacred tools. But before we do
Mhm.
that, we have a review to read from our podcast. We love reviews. Go ahead on over to the Apple Podcast and leave us one, and maybe we'll choose yours to read out loud on the podcast. Eileen, will you read this for us?
I will, yeah. This one's from Jay Sivs. Pretty sure we know who that is. And the title is Absolute Magic. Ellie and Eileen are the witch queens. They are providing so much insight into the witchy world and making it a safe space to identify with. I can't wait for each and every episode, as I know each one will have a magical takeaway. I love this so much because I think it leads right into the discussion we were having in book club last night for our Patreon about this creation of a safe space, a safe community for people who are woo curious to come and explore and sit in ceremony and sit together in community. And yeah, just that feeling of like it can be kind of unsettling or lonely feeling to embark into a world of woo and witchcraft, especially if your community that you're in now isn't in that world. So creating that space is what we are here for. So we're delighted that you feel that way, Jay Sivs.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's true, the community aspect from the Patreon, like that's where it's at. Here we get to be in community together with you, listening to us, going about your day. But it's so lovely to be able to meet in person a few times a month to come together for those things on our Patreon.
So, what magical thing has happened to you recently, Ellie? We're recording this ahead of time. So it's a few weeks before you're hearing this, but there's magic in every day. So I'm sure you'll find us something.
There is magic in every day. So my magical moment is reuniting and recommitting with being in nature at least once a week, which sounds really funny because my backyard is a forest and, I live amongst the mountains. It's just a really lovely place to be, but going into the forest and really walking into that magical sense of things where we have like old growth trees and moss everywhere and the smell of the earth. That is a completely different experience than even the experience of my backyard, which is so great and different.
Mm-hmm.
And so the reminder for me as I go into the forest is just how big the world really is and how small everything else is. I was thinking there's a book that I'm currently reading that is called The Mother Tree.
Mm.
And it's about the forest, basically ecosystem.
Yeah.
And this is exactly how I feel when I walk into the forest. So that might be a future
Mm-hmm.
book as well.
Yeah, that sounds like a beautiful one. I read The Secret Life of Trees last year, and it was very, very interesting. It's just again giving science and voice to what so many people have felt for so long. The interconnectedness is really real. And I'm envious of your tree situation out on the West Coast. I went for a walk outside yesterday morning in the wildlands behind my house, which are very open and it's prairies, right? There's a few trees here and there, and it's beautiful in its own way, but it's not that lush mystery that lives on the West Coast. I
Tell me
think
about, yeah, your magical moment.
yeah.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, my magical moment actually happened this morning as before we recorded. I have a few clients who are signed up for my package of distance healings. And so I dropped in to do a healing for a client this morning who there's a whole bunch of things we're working on, but one of them is her health and her wanting to make sure that she is well moving on in her life. And she's in a state of prediabetes and has a history in her family of heart disease. So that's just kind of there. It's known. I'm not specifically going in necessarily with the intent to address it because there's some other things we're prioritizing. But today, while I was in the healing, I had this sudden like vision drop in, of her kneeling down and eating dandelion leaves. And I was like, what's that about? This is perfect for our topic today. Because I was like, okay, I know dandelion leaves are full of vitamins. I know they're an antioxidant. Like bitter herbs are usually pretty good for us. Beyond that, I don't really know too much about them. I never remember the properties of plants, or I have to work with them several times before I just start to actually remember. So I looked it up afterwards. And what do you think that they do? Well, they help lower blood sugar for people with type 2 diabetes, and they reduce inflammation in the body, which helps prevent heart disease. And they help reduce cholesterol and they help lower blood pressure. And I was just like, of course they do. It's not really a surprise, but every time that I have these synchronicities and these hits where I was really out of the blue in the middle of the healing, I was like, okay, we were doing something totally else, but now you're eating dandelion leaves. All right. And it always ends up being so magically aligned. So that was really just the potency of the wisdom of the planet and Earth and what we've got accessible to us here when we
Speaking
start
of
looking to our planet kin.
Yeah, speaking of dandelion greens and the benefits, I'm doing a TCM reset, and the main thing is dandelion greens. So in my tea blend
Right.
here is milk thistle, chamomile, and dandelion. And
Lovely.
so it's actually a really delicious tea. I eating them is quite bitter for me. I like a bitter green. Like I love a good bitter Chinese green, but this is dandelion greens are like bitter.
My mom, while she's grazing the horses, we have horses out in Canmore. She had taught lessons for years on our horses growing up. And when she goes out to like let them out of the paddock and graze with them, she has to hold on to them because it's like common ground. She eats the dandelion leaves while they're grazing, and she knows which ones are less bitter. There's two different shapes. So she was showing me, she's like, the
I need
ones
to know this.
with like these spiky shape are more bitter than the ones with these spiky shape. And I was like,
I
okay,
Please gather that intel for me because I
I
definitely want to
will.
know. Dandelion greens, whenever you buy them in the store, I'm just like the ridiculousness of the price of
Oh
dandelion
my
greens
gosh.
that. But we
Right.
used to pick them and eat them raw in salads growing
Yeah.
up all the time.
Mixed in with other greens. Like yeah, a whole
Love
mouthful of dandelion greens is a lot, but interspersed with some sweeter greens, it definitely I eat them out of my lawn. I eat my plantain out of my lawn too. I love my
delicious.
weeds. So
Good things.
delicious.
This is
Yeah.
so pertinent to like exactly what we're talking about right now.
Yeah, it totally is. Because today we're going to talk about plant and animal allies and working with them through the year. Last week, we talked a little bit about some of our new Gregorian year traditions, how we don't love that energetic forced reset. But one of the things that a lot of people do, I know I do personally, is I like to choose an animal or plantkin to work with for the year or for the month. Often they kind of come and go as they please, but there's some intentional choosing that can happen as well. So we thought it would be a good time to chat about some plant allies, how we connect with them, and how you might go about choosing one or many to work with for the calendar year if that's something that feels good for you. And same for animal allies. So let's start with plant allies. And we're going to just chat kind of about, cultivating your relationship with plants, growing, harvesting, foraging, all of the things. We'll just see where this leads us. But when I started working with plant allies intentionally, I think I've mentioned this before. I actually was a member of a Patreon where there was a woman who every month wrote a horoscope for each of the signs and included a plant and an animal ally, as well as a rune, actually, to work with for the month that she channeled for that sign and the energies of that sign for that month. And I really enjoyed having somebody else just kind of do the work for me, especially at that point of my journey. It was a fun way to tap in. But she since discontinued her Patreon. And so after I stopped receiving a plant and animal kin to work with each month, I realized I really missed having that shifting through the months. So I started intentionally cultivating my own relationships. And with plants, I decided to intentionally choose which plants I wanted to start working with. And there's so many different ways, right? Like when you're choosing an ally, you can just be like, I'm interested in this plant. And so I'm going to pick it and learn about it and work with it. You could also meditate and ask to be shown a vision of which plant you might want to work with. You could drum dream, which is a similar process to meditation. The drum guides you, but you're still kind of going somewhere in a meditative state and meeting a plant ally. You could pull a card if you have a deck of cards that are plant medicine. You could do it that way, which is a nice, easy way. Or being aware of what plants might be popping up thematically for you or showing up, in cards, in readings, in your natural environment, in the images you're seeing online. If there's something that keeps showing up, that is a really lovely way to choose a plant to work with, because maybe it's trying to get your attention.
I love this idea of like what's showing up for us. It's the same thing with, I think, any of the allies and the tools that we work with. There's something that keeps showing up in my life right now that I'm like, okay, and it's beans.
Beans.
Beans. And I don't know if anybody has ever heard of the bean protocol, but it's this like you eat a large sum of beans per day. And it's something that came into my radar a few years ago, actually, and it keeps coming up. This woman was suffering with some infertility, and she did the bean protocol, and because of the way that it flushes things out, like plants are medicine, food is medicine, and the way that it attaches to some toxins in the body, it helps cleanse the body, and therefore she now has 2 children. And somebody just mentioned it this morning as I was scrolling through my Instagram. She said that she was having a bunch of hormonal issues and was having a really hard time and felt like she was 95, and she did the bean protocol. I mean, it's come up several times between now and then. And I thought to myself, okay, bean protocol. So the next time we talk, if I'm eating a lot of beans, if I'm just eating a bowl of beans, because it's like an exuberant amount of beans, like a cup and a half of beans every meal or something like that. Like,
whoa,
yeah, it's
that
a lot
is
of
a lot
beans
of
per day.
beans.
Yeah. It's not like a doll that you're just like, you're consuming, a cup and a half of red lentils in every bowl, but it's like a cup and a half of kidney beans or other things. I don't remember the protocol now.
That's a lot of beans. And well, it's cool because there's lots of history and, myth and wisdom around beans, especially in North America. It's one of the 3 sisters
It
of
is
plants. So yeah, it would be interesting to see spiritually what beans represent too.
the seed of life. Here we are. The seed of life.
Right.
This is what we're trying to cultivate.
I love it.
Yeah.
Do you have a practice of choosing a plant ally to work with, either for a year or a month, or do they kind of like come and go more fluidly than that?
Yeah, walking the path of a sun priestess. It's not plants in particular, like it's not the plant matter, it's the essence, it's the aroma of the plant that I have been called to work with for quite some time. And so naturally it just makes sense for me to walk this path, because it is something that is, I feel like, really inherent in me, of just having this gnosis about the symbiosis of essential oils and how they move and come together. And I love it. I love aroma. I love all of those things. It's interesting. I had a conversation with somebody the other day about someone calling her a witch or thinking that she might be a witch, and her saying to me, she's a scientist, and her saying to me, like, I actually don't know what this means. And I was like, oh, sister, come closer. Let's talk. And interestingly enough, with this, I actually know her through yoga and through essential oils. But I think that we sometimes don't know that we have that gnosis. And so other people recognize us. We've talked about this before. Other people recognize us for the witches that we are before we can see that for ourselves. And so a long time ago, like very young, I would say 4 to 6 even, we had a massive, it wasn't a garden, it was a field. We had a massive field of vegetables. And it was one of my first entrepreneurial gigs, where we would sit at the farm stand at the end of the road and sell whatever our wares were for today, And it was such a delight for me to feed people. to feed people. Like, we
Mhm.
grew this. And much later in life, my former partner and I, we had small gardens that I think I spoke to this before as well, knowing how much kale, like we planted like 3 or 4
Right.
different kinds of kale. And, 3 rows of 3 feet of kale is a friggin' lot of kale
It's way more kale than any two
that anybody
people can
needs, that
eat.
any one person really needs.
Yeah.
And so understanding the symbiosis of how the plants grew
Mhm.
in a vegetable sense in growing food, it's something that I'm always, when I plant my gardens, I'm always thinking about, okay, these pair well together. We have to rotate this crop. So in the sense of, do I work with plants in terms of, most of it is dried herbs. It's not fresh off the plant for me. And I think this year, this summer will change that, because I have total interest in growing some of the herbs now that I want to use. I've grown tobacco in the past and bergamot and a few other things that I've used, but not like I desire to now.
Mhm.
And then the gardens, like I said, it's just something that I'm really curious about in terms of growing the things that I need. How can I grow something that multiple people can eat? And how can we feed people through our plant allies is really what this
Mhm.
is. But again,
Mhm.
it's this whole witchy aspect of things. Like, it's just a garden, but yet it's so much more.
It definitely is. Long before I was calling myself a witch, I definitely had a really close affinity for gardening. Picked it up in my mid-20s. I didn't grow up gardening. My mom always had lots of indoor plants, but none outdoors. But I just remember loving it and feeling like it was magic. Like, you put these things in the ground and then they grew. And the learning
It is
curve.
magic.
Right? And it's so fun to do. And for me, when I think about like plant allies, I mean, obviously all plants are our allies, but when I'm choosing one to work with, it may not even be physically present with me. When I first chose yarrow to start working with, I didn't have any yarrow in the house. I didn't have any yarrow in the garden. I just was thinking about yarrow a lot. Didn't even look it up really or to read about it. I was just like, yarrow's calling. So I'm just gonna intentionally place that plant in my periphery and have it just kind of be there. I always loved it growing up. I didn't know it was called yarrow. My mom called it Queen Anne's lace, but it's an indigenous plant to North America. And so it was all over the place in Canmore growing up. And it was one of the few wildflowers that show up in those mountainous regions. And the more I started to learn about it, the more I was like, okay, I think this medicine is here to help me with the dichotomous aspects of my life. And we're going to talk a little bit. We each chose a couple of plants to go deeper into, but there's so many ways to work with plants, whether it be in their physical form. When I am actually working with plants in a physical form, it most often is either dried as tea. I really like engaging with plants as tea. I just finished a 12-week exploratory herbal mentorship with Jackie from Shalish Medicines. And each of the herbs that we worked with was in a different format. And the first one was as leaves. And we were to drink it as tea. It was really bitter. And so what I found was that the experience of those 2 weeks of engaging with that plant felt so much more close. There was such an experience of drinking these 2 cups of very bitter tea every day that really linked it and reminded me that's what I was doing and kept me aware of how I was engaging with the plant. And it made me realize I really like engaging with plants that way. Because when we shifted to, I think yarrow was second, and it's this flower essence, and it's like 3 drops under your tongue, however often you need. And I do it, but there isn't that same kind of like, okay, I'm connecting. It takes 2 seconds, and then it can kind of be gone from my head a bit. So I'm really liking the more like tactile. I have the leaves and I'm steeping them and drinking that cup of tea side of things. And it makes sense because that's how I keep gesturing off camera at my hanging yarrow and mint from my garden that's all tied around my altar drying. And that's how I plan to use it as in tea form to drink when needed.
Yarrow is also something that's really special to me. It's an oil that I use every single day. because it's so good for the skin and it's so good for
Mm.
detoxification of the body, cleansing the body. And
Mhm.
I want to speak to this aspect of drinking it as tea is such a great way to interact with your plant allies because you have that moment or several moments as you're drinking the tea to pause and reflect about it.
Mhm.
And the practice that we have, but the difference between the plant essence being put underneath your tongue and an essential oil, let's say, for
Ingested.
example,
Yeah.
yeah, is that your relation with it changes and we can extend that relation by using the flower essence underneath our tongue, let's say, for example, or
Mhm.
using our essential oil, and then meditating or taking a moment to be like, okay, how's this making me feel? Emotionally, how am I feeling? Physically, how am I feeling? Spiritually, how am I feeling? And I think because there's those layers of each plant ally that we use, that we can dive into those layers. I'm getting really like nerdy, like push my glasses up the bridge of my nose about how exciting it is to work with plant allies because there's so many ways that we can interact with them. And the
Mhm.
point that you're making about tea, like that's your favorite way. Essential oils is one of my favorite ways, probably the top.
Mhm.
And this is an invitation for you to figure out for yourself how you interact best with your
Yeah.
plant allies.
And depending what you're using your plant ally for, different routes are going to be effective, right? So if you're wanting pain relief, rubbing calendula on your skin is going to be more effective than ingesting it. Or like with the yarrow flower essence that's under the tongue, I don't know exactly how that would differ in how it ends up working on your body, but I do know that anything sublingual, it's called the first pass effect. And basically, it means that it gets to your bloodstream without being processed by your liver first. And your liver actually breaks down the active medicinal ingredients in a lot of things. And so it doesn't hit your stomach, it doesn't go through the acid, and then it also skips the liver on the first pass through your bloodstream. It goes right to your bloodstream. So I know that there's that potency, which is why you take so much less. That's some of
Yes.
my midwifery knowledge because we used to give drugs to stop bleeding under the tongue or rectally, but under the tongue's just kinder. Um,
Also, we just said rectally on our podcast. Welcome
we
to.
did. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Oh my
Uh,
gosh, I was listening to a clip of the Spiritual Sisters, who are another podcast, and they've got a clip on their page right now that they're talking about vaginas. Something about
can you
like
please send this
condom.
to me?
Yes. We have to have them on as guests. They're keen.
Yeah. If they're talking about vaginas on a podcast, I'm like, I don't care what they're saying. Just like I'm in. Just
Yeah.
tell me what it is. I'm
Yeah.
in.
All right. Come visit.
Yeah.
We'll have fun.
I also want to mention that, speaking to the sublingual, your tincture or your essence, your floral essence is also going to be stronger because of the way that it is made. It is created.
Yeah.
It's created with a lot more product and distilled down into a much smaller amount of output, which is why you take such a small amount, as opposed to tea. Like in my tea, there's 2 teaspoons of dandelion and a teaspoon of milk thistle and chamomile. And chamomile species here in BC is everywhere. And I didn't realize
Oh,
that's what it is.
cool.
It's this, I don't, maybe you know what chamomile looks like, but for the listeners, it's this like short little
Teeny tiny daisy.
spiky, what's that?
Teeny tiny daisy.
A teeny tiny daisy is exactly what it is.
In
And it
clumps,
grows
yeah.
in the cracks of everything here. It grows in a lot of the play structures and things that I go to my organic shops for. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I would not pick out of a public
Side of the road is
park
probably a
because
bad spot. Yeah.
I take my dogs there and I know what they do.
Yeah.
I know where their paws have been.
Yeah.
Uh,
I grew chamomile one year and it can get huge. It took
yeah,
over. It was like this big,
it's like
huge,
mint.
and it's self-seeding. So
You never
beware.
don't have chamomile after that.
Yeah. That and calendula too, which is another like daisy shape. Beautiful
Love.
self-seeding, but it's not going to choke anything else out because the plants, they're individual plants that like grow up quite compactly. Their seeds are really cool. They're like a big curl and they're easy to save because like the whole it like wilts, and then it almost looks, it's not what happens, but it almost looks like the petals curl back in and turn into these like cool, they're quite big seeds. And so you can just like pop the seed head off and they all just shake off really easily.
Oh my gosh, how exciting.
Yeah, almost the size of a sunflower seed, just a different shape.
Wow.
Yeah, they're super cool. Anyways,
Scale
there's
of
our
1
nerd
to
again.
10, how nerdy can we get about plants? 1,000.
1,000. 1,000. I want to just, before we kind of shift, we're going to talk about a few specific plants and then shift into animals. But I do just want to touch on, if you are foraging for plants, just being aware, we've talked about this before, but being aware that you are taking plants from a living ecosystem. And so if you're foraging, making sure those kind of the indigenous principles of don't take the first one you see and don't take the last one, don't take all of anything that you find, and asking the plant for permission. And that can go back to our intuition episodes where we talked a little bit about how to listen to your intuition. And so just taking a moment to sit with the plant, be present to it, ask its permission to harvest some of it, and looking for that yes in your body. For me, it's a bit of a leaning forward sensation, but whatever it is for you, waiting for that. And sometimes you might get a no, and then being okay with that no and carrying on. And then reciprocity. It could be that you want to leave just thanks. You could leave a piece of your hair. If you carry tobacco with you, you can leave tobacco as an offering. It is that kind of remembering to be in reciprocity, remembering that you are a part of this ecosystem too, and to give back in whatever way feels appropriate to you when you are collecting, especially with wild plants.
Let's talk about some of the plant allies that we absolutely adore.
Yeah.
So rose is definitely one that I work with quite a bit. First of all, the mystery school that I'm part of is called the Rosa Mystica. And so she's our sovereign queen at the head of the school. And Rose is thought of as the queen of love. You know, when we think about the energetics of the plant and working with them, this is something that I really love about essential oils, is this kind of like tri-layer of being able to use them. So we have the physical, we have the emotional, we have the spiritual. And so she's definitely the one that calls you into being your sovereign being. Emotionally, Rose is also very calming and nurturing, kind of like the great mother. This is what Rosa Mystica is, the great mother. Just so calming. And because of that, when we look at that, like how everything intertwines on a physical level, Rose is also really excellent for healing skin wounds. Again, great mother, think nurturing things. Your immune system, your skin, you know, it's brilliant. I currently have a rose toner that is the most special treat for me to use. So rose is a plant that has really made a huge impact on my life. I love it. And for anybody who's had Bulgarian rose, like pure Bulgarian rose smells weird because it's so thick and viscous. It's so potent because you need so many roses to make a tiny amount of oil. And usually whenever you have your rose oil that is a pure rose oil, it's not an absolute. We're getting super nerdy here, but it's not an absolute. It's going to be very pricey for a small bottle. For a 5 milliliter bottle, should be well in the few hundreds of dollars. And that's why most often rose is diluted, but it's diluted also because when you dilute the pure oil, we come back into, again, the symbiosis of this a rose aroma in the bottle of pure rose. It's kind of like sludge. Dear Rose, I do not mean to speak ill of you, but it's so thick and viscous. And so that also is associated with like it's sludgy smelling in that way.
Interesting.
And then we have Lang Lang, which is the temple of sensuality. Of course, I love Lang Lang. And this is an oil that you can use on these 3 levels. It's associated with playfulness and with not taking yourself so seriously, but also with sensuality and with your Kundalini rising. So we have these Ida and Pingala snakes that wrap around our energetics. And when they are clear, when they are dancing in unison, if you will, then our systems are operating at an optimal pace. And so Lang Lang helps us connect to that playfulness, which we also need in the seriousness of life. We also need the sensuality, and it is definitely something that has a really alluring, pungent, come hither aroma to it. And so I really love Lang Lang.
Yeah,
Tell me,
I love both. I mean, I don't love ylang ylang. We've talked about this before. I hate the smell. I think I do. I don't know. I don't hate it. I don't love it. I need to find some of it on its own and just like get to know it a bit better. But rose, something else I love about rose is that it grows everywhere. Like it's indigenous to North America and to Europe and across the Middle East. So it exists in so much of the world, and it really holds a beautiful dichotomy of the tender, the soft, the velvety petals, the sensual side of it as well, and the thorns, right? You can be both soft and feminine, and you can defend yourself. And so I really like that space that rose holds for us as well in the actual physical way that the plant presents on the earth.
the Sovereign Queen has boundaries.
The sovereign queen has boundaries, exactly. And I chose yarrow and hawthorn, and I'll start with hawthorn because it's newer to me. It is actually part of the rose family, and it grows abundantly in North America. It looks like the haws look like small crab apples. So you've actually probably seen hawthorns around, and it has thorns, much like the rose. So it does actually have the prickles as well, but it is really very much a medicine to tend to all things heart, like absolutely everything to do with the heart. So it's a really good plant ally for working with grief. And we actually shifted into hawthorn in the form of like a syrup. Actually, one of the ways that Jackie suggested we could work with it is mixed with soda water or something to make a mocktail. I actually just drank it straight out of the bottle the whole time, but we started working with it 3 days before Minka was leaving us. And the first day I took a tablespoon and it just flooded my body. Like it hit me in the most beautiful, tender way. I've never had an experience of a flavor like that before. It was really interesting. It was in a honey syrup tincture. So there was honey there as well, which is so lovely and supportive. But that hawthorn earthiness was really, really beautiful. And it did just feel like a bit of a cracking open, but a safe held space. So for all things heart from the emotional and physically as well, it's really, really helpful for all sorts of heart related things. Everything from cardiac weakness, heart palpitations, murmurs, shortness of breath, aging heart, basically heart, you name it. Hawthorn is a really lovely plant to work with for that. And then I chose yarrow as well because I've been, as I mentioned, called to yarrow and working with it for a long time. And I knew from a while ago that it was helpful for stopping bleeding, like postpartum bleeding. If bleeding is too heavy, ingesting yarrow can help with that kind of bleeding. But it also can bring on bleeding. It can bring on menses. It's really interesting. It's great to pack into wounds as a poultice. It can help stop infection and speed healing and slow bleeding there, but then it can also increase bleeding. And so it's got a whole bunch of dichotomies held inside of it. It could be cooling or warming. It can be stimulating or settling, a sedative. So it's just a cool plant, and I love that it can be worked with in so many different ways, from like fresh flowers right on a wound to the tinctures and the tonics and stuff.
Like I said, I'm already a fan of yarrow. It is something that I use in my castor oil packs,
Mm-hmm.
but I can only use it topically. I can use it most times of the day. Internally, I can only use it in the mornings because of the stimulating aspect to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you bring up an interesting point around the fact that it can be this dichotomy of like cooling and warming. It's like peppermint. Like, how can a plant be both cooling and heating, and or stimulating and calming? And what is so amazing about this dichotomy, it's how our body needs it, is how it
Mm-hmm.
responds to whatever it is. And so
Mm-hmm.
if it needs cooling, it is cooling. If it needs warmth, it warms up. And I think that that's a really cool aspect of working with plant allies, is that you can be in both of those. You can have both of those things at the same time.
It teaches us that you don't need to choose. Like there is that sense of like you can be both. You can be both. It's also a really good one for boundaries and holding and maintaining boundaries. So those of us who work energetically with people, I will often take it right before I drop into healing sessions with clients, just to have that extra little bit of barrier between my energy and theirs.
That's excellent. What a great way to use that.
Yeah.
Let's shift into animal allies. Tell me a little bit about animal allies.
Yeah. So I use the term animal ally. You often people will say, spirit animal, but again, this is kind of co-opting on some indigenous traditions and just being careful about how we're using terms that may or may not belong to our lineage. And so my mentor uses animal archetypes. I like allies because it feels a little bit more personal, whereas animal archetype feels like, okay, it's an archetype. It feels more out there. It's not a wrong way to use it. I just personally like to speak about them in terms of allies. And there's several lines of teaching that will say that we are assigned an animal ally before we incarnate in this world, and that one ally will be with you throughout your time from birth to death. And when we think about that particular animal ally that we may walk with for our whole lives, that's a really personal thing. It's not one to necessarily just be shared willy-nilly with the world. But we can also have animal allies who come to walk with us for a time through a season of life, through a trial, or through a period of joy. And they show up in so many different ways, a lot like our plant kin or our plant allies. Choosing or finding or knowing who your animal allies are can come up in all the same ways, through meditation, through drum dreaming, through noticing who and what is showing up all around you, and through deciding or choosing a specific animal who you want to develop a relationship with or walk with for a time. Knowing if you know the medicine you need, you might choose to cultivate a relationship with that particular animal.
I like that we have the distinction here about addressing this as an animal ally, or an archetype for that matter. I think of the ally as like somebody who we walk with,
Mm-hmm.
and it can also be somebody whose medicine we need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it can be both for sure. I think the way that for me specifically that I really love choosing or finding my animal allies is just noticing what's showing up. And so for me, earlier in the year, this year, it was spiders like everywhere. My backyard is a spider haven. Or like you go out in the morning, every morning I'd walk outside and there would just be, they'd be everywhere. They're little tiny guys. They're not, for the most part, there was a few bigger ones, but they'd show up on my computer. They're in my basement too, for sure, but they just around, and really, I was really noticing them this year. And so I felt like that was something that I needed to work with and walk with for a little while. And often, I work with coyote medicine a lot because I can always hear them behind my house. I see them weekly at least because they live in the wildlands behind my house and they're very present. Choosing that way by based on what's coming up. Woodpecker shows up for me often too. And again, I live by a bird sanctuary. So so the birds are present. But that one, there's been a couple of times where woodpecker would show up in my backyard and just be like staring at me. I'm like, what do you want? What's going on? Why are you there? What are you trying to tell me? And so I find it really fun when those kinds of things happen to then like dive into what the spiritual significance of that animal is.
I love this. Again, this like what's showing up for you. I have hummingbirds that show up for me quite often.
Mm,
And even though we do have a hummingbird feeder in our backyard, I actually like rarely see them at the feeder. I often see
mm,
them around the deck. I see them in our cherry tree, which is right outside our bedroom window. And it's just like a lovely occurrence when that happens. And one of my best
mhm.
friends, also woodpeckers come to her. She lives in the forest now, and woodpecker shows up to her often.
I think that what's one of the things here I'd love to speak to because it shifted for me this year was this sense of like, yeah, I live near a bird sanctuary, so obviously I see birds. It doesn't mean anything. Or you can decide that it means something. And it's one of those ways of just imbuing the mundane with magic, especially in those ways where it's obviously not hurting anyone. If I'm like, oh, Pecker has a message for me, what do they symbolize? And then being able to go and say, okay, like what is that saying? What is that showing to me in my life? What is that shining a light on, as it were? And had I not done that, I guess no big deal, but doing it allows me to kind of deepen my experience of day-to-day life and deepen my presence and my growth too, allowing things to be guiding lights for you along this journey is what creates the magic in life.
I think the point that you're making here, it's so good to see that it's like everything is magical. Like bird
Mhm.
sanctuary or not, everything is magical. How many other birds do you have showing up frequently in your backyard or that you take notice of? This whole thing, like
Mhm.
what comes up for you? What do you see? Apparently I have a raccoon that lives in my front tree. Besides on camera, on our like front door camera, and my love has seen them. And I'm like, I have never seen these raccoons, and they literally live outside
Interesting.
my window. And
Ah.
so I agree that we can really chalk this up to like, oh, of course we live next to a bird sanctuary. Of course I live next to the forest. Of course, I used to see so many blue jays when I lived in Quebec. And here, 2 or 3 times now, I've seen a blue jay. I hear an owl all the time. I saw an owl in Quebec, like
Mm.
literally an owl swooped in front of me. I've seen many owls actually. I'm so
Mm.
fortunate for this. Swooped in front of me and tried to pick up a bunny and
Whoa.
almost, yeah, it was like we were on the nature network in front of me as I was driving home one day. And at that point, my love was like, I have never seen an owl. I have never seen an owl. So I think that
Mm.
it's true. We can really chalk this up to it being, of course, it's nature. We live in nature. Apparently, there's lots of coyotes around this area. A friend of mine had an unfortunate demise with a cat and a
Yeah.
Yodi, and I have never seen one in
Here.
urban on the urban streets. I've seen them out in the country where we are more of now, walking across the street in the fields. I've never seen it walking down the back alley in Vancouver, which is
Right.
where these were,
Right. Yeah.
you
Yeah,
know?
it's so interesting how they show up to us and show us. And yeah, that allowing. And they don't always show up in person. In person.
Yeah.
They have personhood. Yep, we're giving them that for sure. And but they don't, sometimes it's in dreams or in visions or in meditations. I was working with Owl last year quite a bit, and for a while I wondered if it was my animal ally, like for this lifetime. I kind of wanted it to be. It's a very glorious animal to be.
Mm.
It feels like, oh yeah, I want that one. It's not. It was just walking with me for a time, and I'm thrilled with the animal that I do carry and carries me. But it's fun to just allow and see where the threads lead you.
Yes. See
Yeah.
where the threads lead you.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about the qualities of spider and coyote?
I do. Yeah. Before I do that too, I just want to note, as you start to play around with working with animal allies, with finding them, with, learning more about them, it's really lovely to start with not jump diving straight into their spiritual significance Google search, because so often those are rooted in other people's traditions, and they're totally fine, and I think there's wisdom in those traditions. But a really fun way to kind of start to get to know them is like research their habitat, research their diet, their movement patterns. Do they live in groups or are they solo? How do they mate? How long do they carry their young for? What's their parenting style? All of these things can give you some really beautiful entry points to start to cultivate a relationship before you go straight into that. What does this mean spiritually or significantly? And so obviously do that too. And then seeking out myths or stories that involve these animals is another really cool way to get to know them, and also to root yourself in the land and the stories that this land holds about the animals that you're working with. That's another thing to note too. Usually your animal ally who is for you for the lifetime, it's, unless you're from Australia, it's probably not going to be a kangaroo,
Right.
right? It's going to be an animal that is indigenous to where you are born or where your ancestors are from.
Right.
Yeah.
Hot tip.
Hot tip. So yeah, I'll briefly kind of mention my animals that I chose to dive into today, and I've already mentioned them a little bit, but spider, I think the thing that really struck me when I started paying attention to spider before I started reading about what they meant was the fact that so they build their webs on my table outside. I work at my table, so I have to destroy some of their webs every morning. To pull out the chair, we'll destroy at least 2 webs. And then, like, to sit down is another one. To get a chair clear from Minka would be another one. And so every day I'd come back outside and they would have rebuilt their web in the same place. It's that like tenacity and that willingness to do the work over and over and over. And the beautiful perfection of that work every time was really something that kind of drew me to them. And it was, for me at that time, it was a real message of like, keep going, just keep going, just keep going. But spiritually, when you look up significance, there's this sense of balance, and that makes sense. Their webs are a beautiful balanced design. There's creativity, and they literally create silk from their bodies to spin these webs. And then personal growth and self-awareness are in there too. So that was a really fun way to work with spider and to take away the creep factor, because a lot of people have a hate relationship. I'm not even gonna say love hate. A lot of people really don't love spiders, and they tend to not bother me unless they're in my shower or my bedroom.
We've got boundaries.
I've got boundaries. Those are my, I'm sorry, spider, you're not allowed here. And then coyote, as I mentioned, it just keeps showing up for me. And it's a bit of an uneasy medicine to walk with because the coyote's a trickster and they're not always seen in a totally positive light. They play lots of tricks. They can play tricks on themselves by accident. But there's also this like joy and humor. You know, they sing, they laugh. And spiritually, part of their significance is this survival, this adaptability. Is really hard to get rid of coyotes. Every farmer who ever had sheep that wanted to get rid of coyotes will tell you that. And there's this like really deep resourcefulness and cleverness. They are tricksters because they are clever, they're smart. And so that really felt like, again, this supportive medicine to walk with, especially through this first year of being fully an entrepreneur. It was really helpful. Every time I hear them sing, it's just like a balm to my soul. Like, okay, yes, thank you. Thank you.
What I love about these two, I want to comment on spider and coyote.
Yeah.
Spider, to me, they're also the storyteller because
Yes.
they weave their story in their web, and I love this like creativity part. And it's like every time that their web gets torn down, them rebuilding the tenacity, but it's the same story that they're singing. It's the same thing that they're doing. And then with coyote, as a former farmer and somebody who lives in and amongst other farms, it is interesting that coyotes also lure your dogs.
Mm.
So they sing them and they'll go back and forth. They'll literally surround in an area and they'll lure by one of them singing over here or yipping over here. And then the others will come to attack and take over your pup, basically try to, well, either depending on the size, we'll try to eat it for dinner or we'll try to take it in and breed with it.
Right.
So
Interesting.
yeah, and you know, this whole trickster piece of it is that if you're on a farm, I think the only way to get rid of them is a donkey is such a
Huh.
great protection animal.
I love that.
In the country, everybody had a donkey
I
because
love donkeys.
yeah,
I
I
really
love
love donkeys.
yeah, I love hearing their hee-haw. I can't remember what that's called. It has
Bray,
a what is it?
braying.
Ray, yes. There we go. And one of the Great Pyrenees dogs, the working dogs that are also really good for protection and that stay outside.
Right.
And those big white monsters.
Yeah,
Love those as well.
my sister had a Great Pyrenees Aussie Shepherd cross for a while. She was beautiful, but she got all of the Aussie, like she got the Great Pyrenees coloring and everything else Aussie Shepherd. She was psychotic.
I think
Not an indoor city dog, folks.
no, not
No, working farm animal.
Prior to this angel behind me, one of my pups, you can see in the frame if you're watching this on YouTube. Prior to her, one of the dogs that I had my eye on, because I love training and I love working with dogs, was a smart breed, in quotations, like an Aussie Shepherd. And I am very thankful that I have this Mexican mutt who is smart as a whip, but just
A
speaking
little lower energy.
yeah.
What are your animals? Which animals did you choose to chat with us today about?
Yeah, I walk with Bear a lot. And interestingly, one time that I was doing a journey with Pete Bernard that we spoke about on last week's podcast, he does a journey through at the end of all of his talks. And often you're invited into an animal ally that meets you. And coming out of this one day, I turned to my friend and I said, have you ever fucking touched a grizzly? Because I have. I could smell them, I could feel them, and just the grace of hearing their footsteps and their breath. It's just a phenomenal experience. And I said, I will probably never in IRL be able to walk with a grizzly, but I'm telling you, in Journey, they're a person that comes all the time. And the qualities of the bear are things like hibernation and sleep and just slowness, like rest and rejuvenation. And they're really a graceful animal. And so bears in general are something that has definitely captured me for quite some time.
There's a really big factor of protection there too, right? Like mama bear, that safe, protective. I encountered a bear in one of my first drum dreams, and I just it was sitting up by a river, and I just sat down and it like wrapped me in a big hug, and I hadn't felt that safe and held. At that point, I really needed it. It was just like, oh, thank you.
Mother Earth energy for sure. The great mother is the bear. And then I often work with Wolf. And actually, Wolf is the archetype or the ally that is at the head of my business. And so, as the Matriarch Collective and as somebody who leads women, Wolf, I think, is one of the more misunderstood because we have this archetype of the lone wolf and the lonely wolf. And the lone wolf is often a woman. And the lone wolf is actually very rare. And if there is a lone wolf, it's just because they're looking for a new pack. And there's a whole process with wolves on how you get accepted into the pack. And often the patriarchs of the wolf pack are the ones that rear the children, which I think is just a really interesting concept. You talked about what's their habitat, what's their diet, what's their parenting style. And the alpha wolf is not always a male, it's often a female. And how the female, as the alpha, governs the pack is different than how the male governs the pack. And has the final say really as to who comes in and who goes out. And furthermore, who is bred that year. And so I read a book about a Yellowstone alpha wolf, female alpha wolf, the Yellowstone alpha female wolf. And I'm really fascinated by the reintroduction of wolves into places like Yellowstone, which is just a phenomenal story. If you have not YouTubed that, go ahead and do that. Do yourself a favor, because as apex predators, it trickles down literally to impacting the trees. And I think that that's really, with wolf energy, it's all about how we walk in the world and how that impacts the rest of the world.
I listened to it was a brief podcast, and I can't remember, one of my book club gals shared it to our group, and it was about the way that the reintroduction of wolves allowed the trees to grow back.
Yeah, that's the Yellowstone story.
Yeah, it is. It's so cool. And another book I read recently, Ways of Being, talked about how when they started to actually track wolves, the range of their movement over the course of a year was like absolutely exponentially vaster than anyone had ever imagined. It's so cool.
And
it really
how they
Yeah.
hunt away from the den and how they bring food, like, the mother eats the food and brings it back to the den by regurgitating it.
Yeah.
And I'm reading many a book, but I'm also reading a book about like rewilding our animals and
Hmm.
therefore rewilding ourselves. And the first concept of the book is the desire to have wolf as pet is so strong in a lot
Yeah.
of people because of the archetype or the ally that they represent.
Yeah.
And then we went to Cabela's or Bass Pro, same difference, one day, and apparently there's a man who has a wolf dog who he socializes at Cabela's. And we literally walked in and I said to my love, there's something here for me. And they were like, okay, well, what is it? I was like, like we were there for like a Yeti mug or something. I was like, no, there's something here for me. And we were walking around and all of a sudden they like panned towards the place that I was looking in awe and looked at me and said, what is it? And I said, that's a wolf. That's a wolf right there. And the
Mm-hmm.
long-leggedness of the wolf is so, it's a sight to see, first of all. And then I had a really excellent, to speak to the last part about wolf, I had a really magical moment driving across Canada the last time from Ontario to BC as my solo trek to move here again. And there was a wolf who crossed the road and ran in the ditch with me as I was driving along the highway in Saskatchewan. And I
Cool.
had this moment of like, wow, okay, I see you. We've made a decision. We're doing
Ah.
the right thing. I was thinking, I'm leaving my family. I'm leaving my family. What am I thinking? Like, I'm going back to a place that I used to know, but it calls
Mhm.
me in a way that feels more home than even where my family is could ever represent. And in thinking about this, and Wolf shows up to show me that my community is here. My family
Amazing.
is here.
Oh, they're so incredible. I've seen one once in the wild at a bit of a distance, and I initially was like, "Oh, there's a coyote," because it was pretty typical to see coyotes. Like they're not, especially in Canmore. And then I was like, "That is too big to be a coyote." It was so cool. Yeah, magic,
I
magic,
also
magic.
had a moment that you're reminding me of about seeing them in wild. I was driving to a retreat and I was going over some things in my head of like, I need a sign. Like I was just being so bold. Like I need a sign here, sign. And the sign needs to be a wolf. And so I'm driving in nature and um expecting to see a wolf. I saw tons of deer. I saw other animals. I saw an eagle that day when
Mhm.
I got to the retreat and I was a little bit late and I kind of rushed in to take a seat at the table that we were all gathering at. And the woman across this big conference table from me is looking at me with a massive wolf tattoo. And I said, oh, okay. You don't always get the signs in the form that you think you're going
The
to get them.
way that you think you would like, yes, yes, it's that being open to them arriving in whatever way that they are meant to.
Yeah. But like, hardy har har universe.
So as you move into 2024, we'd love to hear if you decide to work with a plant or an animal ally. You don't have to tell us which it is if it feels private, or you can share. If you're sharing with your community on Instagram, we'd love if you'd tag us because it's always fun to share together. Thank you so, so much for tuning in this week.
Okay, Woo Crew, thanks so much for listening in. We love hearing from you. So if you've listened to this episode and absolutely loved it, take a screenshot, post it onto Instagram stories, tag us, let us know what you thought. Let us know, like we said, if you're working with any animal allies or if you have questions about them. We'll see you next week for the next episode. Thanks again, Woo Crew.